All right. Sorry we're a little late. We got the stream going. And open up your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We'll get started with that this morning. I want us to actually start by reading the passage. We're going to look at verses 2 to 16 this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Starting in verse 2, because remember last week we put verse 1 in chapter 10. So starting on verse 2, Paul writes, "Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. For she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off, or her head shaved, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman. And all things originate from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God." Okay, I want to start this discussion off with a bit of an excursus on the term culture. We usually bring that word up whenever we're looking at this passage. And here, the wearing and the not wearing of coverings has to do with the distinction between men and women. To some, Paul is saying you should not wear a covering to worship. The question obviously pops up in our minds, why? And he answers that by saying, because you're a man. To others, he says, you must wear a covering. And of course, we ask why? Because you're a woman. And Paul is saying that for a man to wear a covering would be to appear in the inappropriate dress. That would be the role, and a role for a woman. And for a woman to wear not wear a covering would be the same thing. She'd be dressing inappropriately for that situation. So the wearing or not wearing of a covering in worship depended on whether you are in the role of authority or whether you're in a role of subordination. That's what he's getting at. But who determined this? Obviously, in our society, such things not true as far as the congregation here goes, I should say. But why is it true when Paul wrote it? And should we practice what we're reading as far as head coverings go today? The answer to those questions necessarily leads to a consideration of culture. It would be a mistake to assume that I think these New Testament writers were culturally naive or ignored social issues. They did not. They deal with these things. But on the other hand, to dismiss their teaching as simply being culturally conditioned is, I think, going a little too far in what they're talking about. What I'm saying is, while we don't want to bind the cultural aspects of the New Testament teachings on every generation as we're going down the line, but we also want to be careful as to what we consider to be culturally conditioned. As far as, well, this passage is cultural, it doesn't apply to us. I'm going to say that's not true, but bear with me about when we get to it, when we look at this, what's happening. The two major categories when it comes to culture has distinctions is social structure and social expression. When I say social structure, every society has a government, right? And every society has marriage of some type, right? That's the structure. But what's the expression of that structure? As far as government goes, some are republics, some are democratic, some are socialists, some are monarchies, some are theocracies, thank you, and whatnot. And as far as marriage goes, every society I ever read about and seen have marriage, but how do they express those things is different. And how, the way we have ceremonies and get married and how the marriage relationship goes, sometimes even, there's different expressions of those things. And so there's structure, right? And then there's expression. The problem occurs when we begin to properly distinguish the two, which one is structure and one being expression. Social expression is mistaken sometimes as a structure. Sometimes the structure is mistaken as the expression. And we see that happening in our society with almost everything. As far as, for example, our government. What kind of government do we have in America? Okay, we're a representative republic. Does it always act that way nowadays? Sometimes it does, but sometimes it acts more democratic. Sometimes it acts more communistic. Sometimes it acts more socialistic. Our expression is beginning to blur to culture. To the structure of it. And that's not a good thing. What about marriage? You got the structure and you have expression, but those two things are starting to blur together now, isn't it? Now they're starting to say the structure is this, and they're doing something that makes it more difficult to see and understand what it is. And that's what's going on here in Corinth. They're getting things mixed up and they're confusing things. And so Paul is going to go in this section to deal with the problem. But in what way? When we get down into the text, we see that, and we'll deal with this when we get there, about the woman prophesying and praying. Now, there's a lot. You open up the commentators and they're kind of all over the place about what situation this is in. Some say it's in private, when she's prophesying or when she's praying in private. But does it matter if her head is covered if she's doing this in private? Is he really saying her head ought to be covered in a private time like that? I don't think so. So look at verse 2. That's where we're going to start, where Paul says, "Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you." Now, we see the term traditions, and we may be thinking about the way we say traditions. When I say we got to be careful with our traditions, traditions are something we do, but it's not binding. It's not something that we need to do. That's not the way I think Paul is using it here. When he says hold firmly, what does that mean? Obey. Do it. Don't let it go. He's also talking about prophesying and praying. You see it with the men and the women, and later on it mentions the women with praying as well, but no prophesying. Now, I think that he is talking about the corporate assembly, the worship assembly. You may be thinking, but wait, Chris, women aren't allowed to get up and pray, especially prophesy. That'd be the preaching, because in chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians, he tells them that they can't do that. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, they're to be silent there as well. How do you reconcile those two? Well, we're going to look at that. Don't worry, we're going to take a look at that, and you'll see that it does fit with what Paul's writing if you look at it within its context. So I think he's moving from the questions he was looking at earlier, and he's going to start answering questions that have to do with the assembly, because right after this, what else does he talk about? The Lord's Supper, and then the use of the spiritual gifts within the assembly. So it's, the assembly is in the context, and this falls in that same context, I believe. So he brings up that tradition. Verse 3, we're in chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians. "Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. For she is one and the same as the woman who whose head is shaved. Okay. So you got that word covering there. Now, what kind of covering is he talking about? I think he's talking about, the words used here, we see it used all throughout, a head covering, like a hat. Or I don't know what the Corinthians were using, but I'm thinking it's probably more of like, what do you call those things, the thing that the Islam does? Burqa. The burqa, where it's maybe something similar to that, or maybe it's just pulled over and wrapped around the bottom of their head. I don't know. But there's a covering they have. And apparently when the women are coming into the assembly, they're taking it off, is what I'm assuming is going on here. The men don't do it, the women do. But now let's look at verse 5 there, where we see that phrase, praying and prophesying. Read it again. Every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. Okay. So what is happening? It sounds like when we read it, does it sound like they are getting up and leading a prayer? Does it sound like they're getting up and actually prophesying? I've always been told that is what this passage is saying. But they'll reframe it in some way so they're not supposed to be doing that or whatnot. When someone gets up in a corporate assembly and they lead a prayer, who all is involved in the prayer? Everyone's involved in the prayer. When I'm up there and I'm preaching and I'm giving the lesson, who all is involved in that lesson? I was going to mention that. Everyone awake. Because if you're asleep, you are not actively participating in that lesson. But that is what he's talking about. So if her head is uncovered during the prayer, it's a disgrace to her. Why? Why is that a disgrace to her? Acting like a man? Is that what's going on, though? Is it the theme? Let me back up. I forgot to mention this. The theme of this whole section has been found in verse 3, when he says, "I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ." The theme is authority and subjection. That's the theme. Now, the fact, if someone is acting like a man, like in the sense as, not as far as like dressing like a man, like the problems that we have in our society today, but in the sense of authority, then there's a problem. They are blurring the line. That is a symptom. But what Paul wants them to see is what God had put in place as far as authority and those who are in subjection. And there is a blurring of the line going on in Corinth concerning those roles. And so it is the grace because of what she's doing. And yeah, you could say she's acting like a man in that role by doing that. Now, how did Paul find out about this? Someone must have told him, right? So that means people in the congregation were uncomfortable with what was going on and made mention of it to Paul. Or maybe it was Chloe's people who brought that up when they went and talked with Paul. We saw that in the beginning of the letter. And so it's an issue. Now, they're discussing head coverings. Do all the churches in the New Testament times practice head coverings? Ephesus didn't, because we read about their braided hair over in 1 Timothy. They didn't have this practice. This is a culture thing in Corinth, right? That's what's going on. I remember way back when, I think I was still a teenager. I was at a congregation where when you walked in, they had a big bin of hats. And if you were a woman and you didn't have a hat, they gave you one. And I always remember thinking, yeah, that's a little strange. But I wonder if they were looking at this and they thought they needed to wear a hat. Now, what would you do if you were in that situation? I've always thought about that. It's like, what would I do? If Jenny and I walked in there and they told Jenny to wear a hat, what would we do? Well, I would probably suggest to Jenny, take the hat. And I would probably tell them, look, we don't think this is necessary, but we'll take it just to keep the peace. But I don't think that's necessary. And just for that. Because, they don't understand, maybe a little weaker in their understanding of that, but it doesn't hurt anything if that's what they want to do. I've told the story many times of when I went to Hawaii and I went to the assembly for the first time. I wore a black suit, full, jacket and everything. And for those who are visitors, how many people do you think were wearing a suit? Yeah, none. Even the preacher was wearing shorts and a nice Hawaiian shirt, and I'm sitting there in black, sweating because they didn't have air conditioning, looking like a total dummy. That evening, I wore my Hawaiian clothes. Didn't wear the suit again. It was that's the culture there. It's the way it is. Okay, back to what we're looking at. So the woman in verse 5, but every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying, they're actively participating in the assembly, but if they're doing this without the hair covering, they're a disgrace. For she is even one and the same with the woman whose head is shaved. Verse 6, for if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. Now this goes back to what Jim made comment. She's acting like a man. I don't think they were trying to look and be men, but I do think they were looking toward the authority the men had. And so Paul's saying, well, if you're going to go that far, why don't you just cut your hair to look like a man? Now, what does that mean, to cut your hair to look like a man? Do women have short hair today? I've seen it. I've seen women who have short hair, and they look like women. They're not trying to look like a man. Now, there are women today who cut their hair, and they are trying to look like a man. That's their goal. What are they doing? Structure, expression, and they're blurring the lines. That's what they're doing. They're looking at that authority that they see there, and they want everything to be, the way they put it today, equal. Now, Paul's going to get to that in just a moment about how, is there any difference as far as who we are? I'm not talking about strength or mentality or anything like that. Is there really any difference? In the grand scheme of thing of eternity, is there any difference between men and women? No, Paul's going to bring that out. No, there's not. So why is the man the head, and why is the woman in subjection? Paul's going to get to that here in just a moment. So, as I already mentioned, women are showing up to the worship assembly without the customary head coverings worn by the Corinthian women in public areas. And verse 6, he says, well, won't you just cut off the hair? But obviously, who would do that if they're being honest? So, if women are going to say, if you're in public as men without the covering, might as well go all the way. But we know that they would see that as shame, and they would not do that. Now, verse 7 says, for a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. So man is the image of God. And in this context, he's talking about the role of authority, a term not repeated in describing the women who are not in a position of authority. Glory is that which brings honor. Now, why would women ever want to take the role of leadership? And do we see any examples of that in the Bible? Deborah, but she was a judge. See, but we don't know her origins other than she was made a judge. But yeah, and she told what was his name? Barak. I think it was Barak. Told him that here's what you need to do, but he wouldn't do it without her. And she said you would lose what? The glory and the honor. You'd lose it to a woman, and that's exactly what happened. But there's another occasion where Miriam, Moses' sister, Miriam, right? Yeah, Miriam. She, her and Aaron, they wanted to have the same authority that Moses had, right? Who got in trouble for it the most? She did. Leprosy and sent out away from the camp for a time. And there's other occasions of that as well. And in our day and age, not looking at our society, but within the church, we hear about women many times, kind of not necessarily blurring the line, but taking more of a lead role. Why is that happening in the church today? The culture, okay, true, yeah, the culture around us. But I've been seeing that happening even before the culture has been kind of degrading in that way for a while, but I've been seeing that happening also before that, and I blame the men. I think men are lazy, and we are not stepping up to be leaders. And so there's this big gap, and I think women get frustrated, and then they think, well, fine, I'll do it. And they step in, or they step up. And it's the men's fault that that's happening. She shouldn't be doing that, but he shouldn't have been doing nothing either. We have our young men who are going out, and we're hearing about some great things that they're doing in these congregations, immediately being leading songs or preaching or giving devotionals, and those are all good things. But why? Why are they immediately put into positions of authority in these congregations? I think it's a great thing, but where are the men of those congregations at? Why are they so excited to have it? Because they don't have men stepping up to fill those positions. They ought to. What should have happened is they come in, and then the men of that congregation be, hey, wow, these guys are ready to go. Let's bring them under our wing and help bring them up further in that leadership role. But they're not. They put them straight into it because we have a lack of leadership. And when there's a hole, people are going to look to fill it. And problems are going to occur, and the lines get blurred of what God had put forth. We've read verse 7. Verse 8. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. So what is important here is not the order of creation, but the origin and the purpose of woman's creation. By the way God brought about creation, he's established the roles of authority and the roles of subordination for men and women. So who was made for whose sake? Well, women were made for our sake. When God saw Adam and he had to name all the animals and no suitable helper was found for him, he made Eve to help him out. And I know that we need that because when Jenny leaves, I'm all alone, I miss her. I can't do it alone. When I'm gone for a long period of time and she's alone with the kids, she misses me. It's a lot of work to do it on her own. Connor knows about that right now, right, Connor? Oh, she's back. Are you happy? Yeah. Been along with 2 babies and an ear infection and some other issues, but he's alive. The kids are still alive too, right? All right. So we need each other. That is there. Verse 10. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Okay. What is the symbol of authority? Well, what have we been talking about in this context? The covering. That is the symbol of authority. It represents something there in Corinth, and that is that she recognizes that she is not in the role of authority. That is given to the man. That's what it's saying. And that's why he brings up because of the angels. The way I view that is just like the way in Jude verse 6 where he says, and angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode. What is Jude saying when he brings that up? What angels didn't keep their own domain? Abandoned. Satan and what was that? What was their role? Huh? Yeah, be subject to us. They're going to serve us. And they said, no way, Jose. And they took a hike. So he's saying, women, when you abandon that, you're just like the angels who also abandoned their place. Don't do that. Now, would you say that you right now are more powerful than an angel? No. Women, it is not that we are better or yet you're less. Not at all. Not at all. But God did set a certain order to things within the church. And that's just the way he said it. And the way that our culture is right now, it makes men even more scared to step up to the leadership position. And as Gail was already saying, men are scared to step up, maybe because of the culture around. And that is definitely going to affect it. Does it not? It does. It does. We have to step up and fill in those leadership gaps. And the church does have leadership gaps. Verses 11 and 12. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman. And all things originate from God. So there's Paul making that distinction that there is no one greater than anyone here. We all need one another. However, God did set roles of authority, and we need to have that. If we don't have people who are stepping up and actually maintaining a role of authority, what happens? Chaos. What's that? It breaks down. I think we're seeing that in the world today. Who is stepping up and filling the leadership role in our world? Well, I'm not talking about like as far as governments go, but yeah, you're right. It seems like more women are stepping up and the men are shrinking back. But who's in charge right now in the world? We really don't know. It's kind of up in the air, it seems to me. And so you have some, putting their foot in the water to see what's going on, and now we have more chaos going on in the world than ever before. Why? No one's stepping up to that leadership position. There's a gap. And we have that in our country as well. No one's willing to step up and say, hey, crime's getting out of hand. We need to go in there and enforce it. No, they're letting everyone do whatever they want. And we got chaos. And chaos is getting worse, and it's getting worse because no one's stepping into authority. Someone has to do it. God said, you're right. Someone does have to do it. I'm going to choose the man to do it. Now do it. And when he doesn't, it creates chaos. Got to step up and take the lead. This is not a class about how to do that. That's for another time. But that's what Paul's talking about here. But he's also looking at the worship assembly. So what did we read last? We're in verse 13. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? I mean, the answer is obvious. Obviously, no. Because the covering shows the distinction between men and women in Corinth. In Corinth. We don't wear hats here. But let's say, have you ever been out to, outside, maybe for a potluck or something, and somebody had a ball cap on, and we're all gathered together, and we're about ready to eat, and we say, let's have a prayer. What do we ask the men to do? Take the hat off. I remember as a little kid, I had my baseball cap and was told, my dad told me, take it off. I took it off, and I'm frustrated because I thought my hair looked bad. And I'm sitting there, and I look up, and during the prayer with my eyes open, I should have been paying attention, but I wasn't, and I noticed some girls, ladies, they had hats on, and they didn't take them off. I was so mad. And I told my dad, I said, why do I have to take my hat off, but she doesn't have to take her hat off? And you know what he told me? Because I said so. That's why. Because God said so. That's why. And so there is structure, and then there is expression. In Corinth, their expression was for women to wear something over their hair, over their head, however that was, while they were out in public. For some reason, the women of the congregation at Corinth, when they came to the assembly, took it off. That made the men probably a little uncomfortable. They didn't like that. And so they asked Paul about that. He's telling them to do what? Put it on. Because of the symbol of authority. That's the way that culture worked there in Corinth. But the passage is about authority and subjection. That's what Paul's discussing here within the worship assembly. All right, before we move on, any comments or questions on what we looked at? I haven't.
I've got an NIV study Bible.
Oh, sure.
Some commentary on the side, but and I think much of it is probably more associated with the cultural aspect. But it states that women in the Eastern Mediterranean covered their hair when they got married. Hair was the chief element of female beauty, so only a husband should view his wife's hair. Uncovered hair was thus associated with seduction. It also goes on to say wealthy women paid a lot for stylish hair fashions and often left their hair uncovered. That probably increased tensions between the wealthy and poor women.
Oh, I guess that's possible, but
Cultural elements.
yeah, but that is true in some places. That's why I'm hesitant to say something specific with Corinth, because I know over in Ephesus they did not cover their hair. They didn't do that. It just depended on where you're at. For some reason in Corinth they had something, and I read up on some histories that we have, and some say yeah they had that, some say yeah no they didn't, and it's hard to know. Some people say well it had something to do with the temple prostitutes, but we just don't know. All we do know, they did cover their head with something, but when they came into the assembly, the women were taking it off, and it was creating some issues among the men as far as the role of authority. So Paul's dealing with that. But yeah, and that's why I started off with talking about culture. Even though this is something he's talking about here, the theme though is authority. Who's got the authority and who's in subjection, and he lays it all out. But in the end, men and women are the same, but God has set out a role for each one. And we ought to hold to that role. Any other good comment, though? I like that.
I'm just saying, we're talking about culture, but I think as far as wearing the covering, it also goes back to time. If you were standing in the pulpit or in that place in Tennessee in 1923, you would probably be teaching that the women need to be wearing a hat.
Yeah.
When I grew up in the church in Tennessee, the women wore hats.
Yeah.
My grandmother would not go to service without a hat, and the other ladies like that would not either. But by the time my mother came along, that had started to decrease, and then it eventually disappeared totally. So it was a matter of what people
Yeah.
thought, what people believed at that time.
Yeah, and I think that must have been a remnant of what that congregation I ran into who were handing out the hats.
And Amish and Mennonites still do.
Right. Yep, and that's true. But those, and that's fine. But as long as we understand that there is a difference between social structure and social expression, but nowadays they don't see a difference. There's not. They blur it all together, and that's sad because it's creating a breakdown of everything. What is marriage? If someone came over into our country and tried to discover what marriage was by watching the media, they would be completely lost or clueless. If they looked at our government and tried to figure out what kind of government we had, they'd be unsure because we blurred those lines, and there's no distinction anymore between the two. Our expression is all over the place. Good comments. Anything else before I move on? Verse 14 and 15. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her. For her hair is given to her for a covering. All right. What's long hair? What's short hair? Do we have measurements? No. How long was men's hair back in the New Testament age?
Well, if you look at the pictures,
I knew it.
Like Jesus and his long hair?
Well, we have statues, and there are some statues you could look at. For the Romans, what was the men's hair like? Short. For the Jews, for most part, it was right here, maybe down a little, maybe about your length. You'd make a good Jew. And the women was how long? Very long. It was very long. The question is, why is it the way it is? What is the goal? What are you trying to say? For example, the women in Corinth, what were they trying to say when they took the covering off? Okay, look at me, but maybe it was a sign of authority. Maybe that's the problem. Like the issues we've been seeing already in Corinth is that they're misrepresenting liberty and misunderstanding some of the teachings. They thought perhaps they had the right to have more authority that they did not have. Maybe that's it. I don't know, but perhaps that's it. Why? I see women with very short hair, but they style it and they're dressed in a way that I have no doubt who they are. They're a woman. But then I also see sometimes women with very short hair, and it's pretty clear what they're trying to do and what they're trying to look like. Same with men. I see men who do have very long hair, but they style it in a way, they dress in a way, so they make you think a certain way when you look at them. What are they doing? Blurring the lines and the distinctions that are there. Our social structure, our social expression helps us be a certain way. But when those expressions begin to blur into structure, and our structures begin to fall apart. That's what I'm saying. Now that's going beyond what Paul's saying here, but it applies in a sense of blurring those lines. If this situation in Corinth wasn't dealt with by Paul, what would happen eventually? It would fall apart. It wouldn't survive. Because it would not be what God designed it to be, the church. The same with anything as far as social structure goes. When we start to not recognize it, it all falls apart. And so Paul ends here in verse 16 with, "But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God." The we here generally understood as apostle, and I think that's what it is, the apostles. And his point is, if anyone rebels, that's what he means. Right? When he says contentious, he's talking about rebelling against the teaching concerning the roles of men and women, whatever dress style that might exhibit that distinctiveness between men and women, then they need to realize that they stand in opposition to the apostles, and they stand in opposition to the churches of God, who believe and practice the distinctive authority and subordination roles of men and women. He's not saying every church is required to wear a head covering. He's not saying that. Because in Ephesus, they did have the braided hair. They did it differently than they do in Corinth. But he is saying that you maintain the distinctiveness. So if you go to a congregation and all the women are wearing hats and they would appreciate you to wear a hat, what should you do? I would wear a hat. But I would make it known that I don't think it's necessary, but I will have my wife wear a hat, not me. But that's all I'm saying. Yes?
It's kind of like the meat.
Yeah.
You don't want to offend the person if they're weaker.
Absolutely.
I'm not saying those people are weaker, but it's doing that.
And their understanding. They may understand, but their conscience just can't let something go. Like, I know there's nothing wrong with listening to music, Christian music that has instruments in it, but for me, it bothers me for so much, probably because I was raised against that for so long. But I think outside the worship service, that's okay to listen to. I just don't do it personally. Any other comments or questions? Or I hope that helps. This is not a passage dictating culture to us. It is a passage about authority and subjection. The distinction between men and women. That's what Paul's talking about within the worship assembly. And I think the Corinthian ladies were coming into the assembly and just taking those head coverings off. And they should not have been doing that because of the culture they were in. Okay. All right. Went a little easier than I thought it would. Thank you. That'll be it. Next week we'll look at the next half, talking about the Lord's Supper.